For over 400 years, Jewish communities had lived, traded, and prayed in the towns of Saxony. They built synagogues where generations worshiped the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They buried their dead in cemeteries that were supposed to last forever, sacred ground where ancestors would rest undisturbed until the resurrection. They raised generation after generation of children who called these German lands home, who spoke German alongside Hebrew and Aramaic, who knew the streets of Erfurt and Meissen and Leipzig the way people know the places where they belong. Then, sometime between 1430 and 1433, all of it ended. Frederick II, the young Elector of Saxony, a man whose nickname was literally the Gentle, signed an order expelling every Jew from his territories, not just from one town, but from the entire Margraviate of Meissen and Thuringia, from all the lands under his control. The synagogues were seized and turned to other purposes. The cemeteries were desecrated, some turned into cattle pastures where livestock trampled the graves of the dead. Jewish property was confiscated by the princely treasury, and the Jews themselves, families who had lived in these lands for 10 generations and more, were forced to leave with whatever they could carry, their debts to them canceled, their claims to their own lives erased. What made it worse was the justification. Frederick claimed the Jews had been sympathizing with the Hussites, the radical religious movement that had been burning churches and devastating Saxon territory for over a decade. It was a charge that made no sense. The Hussites were Christian heretics fighting over Christian theological disputes. Their arguments concerned communion practices and biblical translation. The Jews had no stake in that conflict whatsoever, but the accusation stuck, and the expulsion went forward. So what actually happened? Why did a ruler known to history as the Gentle commit one of the most thorough ethnic expulsions of his era? And what became of the Jews who were forced to leave everything behind? To understand the expulsion, we need to go back centuries before Frederick was even born. We need to understand who the Jews of Saxony actually were, how they came to be there, and the increasingly precarious legal and economic situation that made their position vulnerable. We need to understand the theological hatred that the medieval church directed at Jews and the economic resentment that Christian debtors felt toward Jewish moneylenders. We need to understand the political chaos of the Holy Roman Empire in the early 1400s, the trauma of the Black Death that still haunted European memory, and the devastating Hussite Wars that brought Saxon society to its knees. Because the expulsion was not a spontaneous decision by one ruler. It was the culmination of centuries of building pressure, a perfect storm of religious hatred, economic competition, political calculation, and sheer opportunism. The Jews of Saxony didn't just happen to be expelled. They were systematically pushed toward the cliff for generations, until one crisis finally sent them over. This is the story of how that happened. The first Jews arrived in Saxon lands before the year 1000. They came in the train of Italian merchants, the Lombards, settling in trading towns along the rivers and roads that connected the growing Holy Roman Empire. By the reign of Emperor Otto I in the mid-19th century, Jewish communities existed in Magdeburg, Halle, Erfurt, and Merseburg. These weren't just a handful of wandering traders. These were established settlements with synagogues, courts of Jewish law, and merchants dealing in goods from across the known world. Emperor Otto II granted them various privileges, while recognizing their value to the economy of his empire. How do we know Jews had real economic power in this period? Consider a document from the year 1009. Gunzelin, the brother of Margrave Eckhard I of Meissen, was deposed by Emperor Henry II. One of the charges against him was selling Christian serfs to Jews. Set aside the moral implications for a moment and think about what this tells us. Jewish traders in Saxony at the turn of the first millennium had enough wealth and status that they were purchasing servants from Christian nobles. They were embedded in the economic life of the region at the highest levels. By the 12th century, entire settlements called Jews' villages existed near Magdeburg, Aschersdorf, and Quedlinburg. These weren't ghettos in the later sense. They were recognized communities with their own internal governance, their own leadership structures, their own connections to Jewish communities across Europe. The Jewish Encyclopedia, compiling evidence from the early 1900s, describes relations between Jews and Christians in this early period as amicable. The historical record supports this assessment. Before the First Crusade in 1096, large-scale violence against Jews in German lands was rare. Jews and Christians lived as neighbors, conducted business together, and generally managed to coexist. But the word amicable needs to be understood carefully. Jews were tolerated because they were useful. They filled economic niches that Christians couldn't or wouldn't fill. That's very different from being accepted as equals. The tolerance of the early medieval period was always conditional, always fragile, always dependent on Jewish economic utility, outweighing Christian theological hostility. And that hostility was never far beneath the surface. The position of Jews in medieval Christian society was defined by two fundamental realities. First, they were the only significant non-Christian minority in Western Europe, and second, Christian theology had developed elaborate doctrines explaining why Jews existed and what role they were supposed to play. According to the dominant Christian view, the Jews had been God's chosen people. They had received the Hebrew Scriptures, the Law of Moses, the prophecies of the coming Messiah. But when Jesus arrived, the Jews had rejected him. They had demanded his crucifixion, and for this cosmic crime, they had been punished with permanent exile from their homeland, condemned to wander the earth as witnesses to their own error. This wasn't just medieval prejudice. It was official church theology, developed over centuries by the most respected Christian thinkers. St. Augustine argued that Jews should be preserved but kept in a degraded state, a living testimonies to the truth of Christianity. Pope Gregory I established the principle that while Jews should not be harmed, they should never be allowed to rise above Christians or exercise authority over them. Notice what this doctrine achieved. It created a permanent category of people who were to be tolerated but never accepted, protected but never equal, preserved but always subordinate. Jews existed in this view to serve Christian purposes. When they stopped being useful, the theological permission for their presence could be withdrawn. The practical application of this theology came through law. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, one of the most important church councils of the medieval period, passed a series of restrictions that would shape Jewish life for centuries. Jews were required to wear distinctive clothing so Christians could identify them. In Germany, this typically meant a pointed yellow hat called the Judenhut. Jews were banned from public office and from positions of authority over Christians. They were forbidden from employing Christian servants. Their interactions with Christians were to be minimized and regulated. The justification given was protection. If Christians could easily identify Jews, they wouldn't accidentally eat with them or have intimate relations with them. But the effect was to mark Jews as permanent outsiders, as visible targets who could never fully integrate no matter how many generations their families had lived in a place. If you know anything about medieval Jews, you probably know they were moneylenders. The image of the Jewish moneylender has become so ingrained in Western culture that people assume it was somehow intrinsic to Jewish identity, as if Jews were genetically predisposed to finance. The reality was almost exactly the opposite. Jews became moneylenders because Christian law and social exclusion left them few other options. Canon law, the legal system of the church, strictly prohibited Christians from charging interest on loans. The Bible condemned usury, and medieval theologians interpreted this as an absolute ban. Any Christian who lent money at interest was committing a mortal sin that endangered their eternal soul. But credit was essential to the medieval economy. Peasants needed loans to survive bad harvests. Merchants needed capital to finance trading expeditions. Nobles needed cash to wage wars and maintain their status. Cities needed funds to build walls and churches. The demand for credit was enormous and constant. The solution was obvious. If theologically awkward, let Jews handle the lending. Since Jews were already damned for rejecting Christ, what did one more sin matter? Besides, the biblical prohibition on usury applied to loans between fellow believers. Lending to outsiders at interest was permitted under Jewish law. There's a revealing passage in the medieval Tosafist commentaries where rabbis addressed this question directly. They wrote that Jews were allowed to charge interest to Christians because there is no end to the yoke and the burden king and ministers impose on us, and everything we take is the minimum for our subsistence. Read that carefully. The rabbis weren't celebrating money lending as a Jewish vocation. They weren't claiming that Jews were naturally suited to finance. They were acknowledging a brutal reality. Jews were being taxed so heavily by Christian rulers that money lending was the only way to survive. The rulers demanded enormous sums from their Jewish subjects, special taxes and forced loans and payments for protection that amounted to extortion. Lending at interest was the only way to generate the kind of income needed to meet these demands. The economic logic was straightforward. A Jewish community might be required to pay thousands of florins per year to the local prince for the privilege of continued residence. Where was this money supposed to come from? Agriculture was largely closed to Jews by custom and law. The guilds that controlled most urban trades excluded Jews. Retail commerce generated modest income, but nothing like what was needed to pay princely demands. Only money lending, with its potential for substantial returns on capital, could generate the sums required. So Jews lent money, not because they loved it, not because it was part of their heritage, but because Christian rulers demanded payment, and money lending was the only way to pay. So a vicious cycle developed. Christians excluded Jews from most trades and professions through guild restrictions and social pressure. The only economic niche left was money lending and a few related commercial activities. Jews became money lenders because they had no choice. Then Christians resented Jews for being money lenders, for charging interest, for taking land and goods when loans weren't repaid. The resentment fueled more exclusion. The exclusion forced Jews further into finance. And the cycle continued, generation after generation, building resentment that would eventually explode in expulsion and massacre. Interest rates in medieval Germany typically ranged from 20 to 43% annually. By modern standards, these rates seem outrageous, more usurious in the negative sense of the word. But consider the circumstances under which these loans were made. Jewish lenders had no legal recourse if borrowers simply refused to pay. A Christian debtor could default on a loan, citing poverty, or claiming the contract was invalid, and there was little a Jewish creditor could do. The Christian courts that might have enforced collection were staffed by Christians with their own prejudices and their own debts. They were often reluctant to help Jews extract payment from fellow Christians, and at any moment a king or prince could cancel all debts to Jews by decree, keeping whatever money remained in Christian hands or redirecting payments to his own treasury. Emperor Wenceslaus did exactly this in 1385 and again in 1390, canceling debts owed to Jews across large parts of the empire. Every Jewish lender knew this could happen to them at any time. Every loan they made was a gamble that the political situation would remain stable long enough for repayment. The risk of lending was astronomical, and the interest rates reflected that risk. A lender who expected to lose a substantial portion of loans to default, to royal confiscation, to simple refusal to pay, had to charge higher rates on the loans that were repaid to make up for the losses on those that weren't. But try explaining that to a peasant who had mortgaged his farm to a Jewish lender and now faced the loss of everything, or to a noble who had borrowed heavily to finance a war and now had to sell his lands to repay his debts, or to a merchant who blamed his business failures on the interest payments that consumed his profits. They saw only the rates, not the risks that justified them. The economic function Jews served was essential to the medieval economy. Credit made commerce possible. It allowed farmers to survive bad years and merchants to finance expeditions. Without credit, the economy would have stagnated. But the resentment that this function generated was equally real, and Christian rulers learned quickly that they could harness that resentment for their own benefit. In 1236, Emperor Frederick II formalized the legal status of Jews in the Holy Roman Empire with a concept that would shape their fate for centuries. Kammerknechtschaft, usually translated as serfs of the chamber. The term sounds degrading, and historians have debated its implications. But in its original context, it was primarily a fiscal and jurisdictional concept. Jews belonged to the emperor's private treasury, the Kammer. Their taxes flowed directly to the imperial purse. In exchange, the emperor was obligated to protect them. This might sound like a reasonable arrangement. Jews paid for protection, and the emperor provided it. But notice what it implied. But Jews had no inherent right to live in the empire. Their presence was a privilege granted by the ruler, a privilege that could be withdrawn at any time. They existed at the pleasure of the crown, their safety dependent entirely on their continued utility. And, critically, as the Holy Roman Empire fragmented into a patchwork of territorial states, the privilege of protecting and taxing Jews passed from emperors to princes. By the 1400s, the Saxon rulers were claiming Jews as their own Kammerknechte. A document from 1425 shows Frederick I, father of the expelling Frederick II, explicitly using this terminology. What this meant in practice was that the Elector of Saxony had complete authority over the Jews in his territory. He could tax them, regulate them, protect them, or expel them at will. The Jews had no higher authority to appeal to, no independent legal standing. Their fate depended entirely on the calculations of one man. Before we trace the catastrophes that destroyed Jewish life in Saxony, we need to understand what that life actually looked like. It's too easy to reduce medieval Jews to abstractions, to talk about moneylending and legal categories without remembering that these were human beings living full human lives. The Jews of medieval Saxony prayed and studied. They married and raised children. They celebrated holidays and mourned their dead. They argued about Torah interpretation and gossiped about their neighbors. They worried about their businesses and took pride in their learning. They were people, not legal categories. The synagogue was the center of Jewish communal life. It wasn't just a place of worship but a community center, a courthouse, a school, and a meeting hall. The Jewish community handled its own internal disputes through rabbinic courts, applying Jewish law. Marriages were conducted according to Jewish tradition. Business contracts between Jews were enforced by Jewish communal authorities. The Erfurt community, the best documented of the Saxon Jewish settlements, appears to have been a center of Talmudic learning. The presence of educated rabbis who could teach and render legal decisions suggests a community that valued scholarship, that invested significant resources in maintaining intellectual traditions stretching back to the academies of ancient Babylonia. Jewish education began young. Some boys learned Hebrew, the language of prayer and sacred texts. The most promising students went on to study Talmud, the vast compilation of legal discussions and rabbinic debates that form the core of traditional Jewish learning. A handful might become rabbis themselves, qualified to answer questions of Jewish law and lead communities. Girls received less formal education in the public sense, but they learned the practical observances of Jewish life. The laws of kashrut that governed what could be eaten, the practices of Shabbat that transformed each week's seventh day into sacred time, the rhythms of the Jewish calendar with its cycle of festivals and fasts. The home was where much of Jewish life actually happened. Friday evening brought the lighting of Shabbat candles, the blessing over wine and bread. The family gathered for a meal that marked the transition from ordinary time to sacred time. Saturday was a day of rest, of synagogue attendance, of study and conversation, and simple presence with family. The yearly cycle brought its own rhythms. Passover in spring, with its elaborate Seder meal recounting the exodus from Egypt, its removal of all leavened bread from the home, its message that freedom was possible even for slaves. Shavuot 7 weeks later, celebrating the giving of the Torah at Sinai. The high holidays in autumn, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, days of introspection and repentance and renewal. Or Sukkot, the harvest festival when families built temporary booths and ate their meals under the open sky. Hanukkah came in winter, 8 nights of candlelighting commemorating the Maccabean victory. Purim in the late winter brought carnival joy, the reading of the Book of Esther, costumes and drinking, and the celebration of a genocidal plot averted. Through all these observances, Jews maintained a connection to the ancient land of Israel, to ancestors who had lived there 2,000 years before, to a tradition that claimed unbroken continuity from Sinai itself. The prayers were in Hebrew, the language of the prophets. The Torah scrolls were copied by trained scribes using techniques unchanged for centuries. This was what it meant to be a Jew in medieval Saxony. Not just moneylending, not just legal disabilities, but a complete culture, a coherent way of life, a community that knew who it was and where it came from. The physical infrastructure of Jewish life required constant maintenance. A functioning Jewish community needed a synagogue for prayer, but it also needed a mikveh, a ritual bath used for purification after menstruation, after childbirth, before marriage, and on other occasions. The mikveh required running water, which in practice meant either a natural spring or an elaborate system for collecting rainwater. Building and maintaining a proper mikveh was a significant engineering undertaking. The community needed a cemetery. Jewish law requires burial rather than cremation, and it requires that Jewish dead be buried in consecrated ground separate from non-Jews. A Jewish cemetery, once established, was supposed to be permanent. The dead, once buried, should not be disturbed. This was a sacred obligation. This is why the desecration of Jewish cemeteries was so devastating. When the Meissen Cemetery was turned into a cattle pasture after 1349, it wasn't just the land that was lost. It was the graves of generations, the physical connection to ancestors, the assurance that one's own remains would rest undisturbed among one's people. The community needed a shochet, a trained ritual slaughterer, to provide kosher meat. The laws of kashrut, the Jewish dietary code, required that animals be slaughtered in specific ways with specific prayers, and that the meat be inspected for defects that would render it unfit. Without a qualified shochet, observant Jews could not eat meat at all. The community needed a rabbi, or at least someone learned enough to answer questions of Jewish law. These questions arose constantly. Could a particular food be eaten? Was a particular business arrangement permissible? How should this dispute between neighbors be resolved? What was the proper procedure for this religious ceremony? Jewish law governed all aspects of life, and someone had to interpret it. The community needed a mohel to perform circumcisions, the physical sign of the covenant between God and Abraham that marked every Jewish male on the 8th day of his life. This was not merely a religious ceremony, but a fundamental marker of Jewish identity, the boundary between who was inside the community and who was outside. The community needed scribes who could write Torah scrolls, mezuzot for doorposts, tefillin for daily prayer, and ketubot for marriages. These were sacred documents that had to be written according to exacting specifications. A single error could render them invalid. The training to produce them took years, and the materials were expensive. All of this required people with specialized skills, which meant either producing local experts through years of education or attracting them from elsewhere. A thriving Jewish community was not isolated. It was a node in a network of Jewish communities spanning all of Europe, exchanging not just goods but scholars, legal decisions, and family connections through marriage. The marriage contracts that survive from medieval Germany reveal these networks in intimate detail. A bride from one city might marry a groom from another, linking families across hundreds of miles. Young men seeking advanced Talmudic education might travel to study with a renowned teacher, living with the teacher's family for years. Rabbis seeking positions might move from community to community over their careers, building reputations that crossed political borders. This interconnection was both strength and vulnerability. It meant that Jewish communities were not isolated. They could share information, provide refuge to each other in times of trouble, maintain the coherence of Jewish practice across vast distances. A legal question that arose in Erfurt could be sent to a great rabbi in France or the Rhineland, and the answer would travel back along the same network of connections. But it also meant that what happened in one community affected others. Refugees from persecution in one city strained resources in communities that took them in. News of massacres traveled along the same networks that carried legal decisions and marriage proposals. The destruction of one major community could send ripples through the entire Jewish world, disrupting networks of scholarship and family that had taken generations to build. The Erfurt treasure gives us a rare glimpse into the material culture of a prosperous medieval Jewish community. Among the items hidden during the 1349 massacre were gold rings, silver brooches, precious gemstones, and thousands of coins from across Europe. This was serious wealth, the kind of portable assets that a family might accumulate over generations of successful commerce. One ring is particularly significant. A Jewish wedding ring inscribed with the Hebrew words, Mazel Tov, good luck, the traditional congratulation at weddings. It's a beautiful object, gold with intricate filigree work, designed to be worn by the bride during the wedding ceremony itself. Looking at it today, you're struck by how human it is. Someone chose this ring for their wedding day. Someone's mother or grandmother might have worn it before. Someone thought, in a moment of extreme danger, that this ring was worth hiding, worth trying to preserve for a future that never came. The coins in the hoard tell their own story. They came from France, England, the Low Countries, the Italian states, the Holy Roman Empire itself. Jewish merchants dealt in international trade, and their coin hoards reflected those connections across all of Christendom. The silver ingots suggest involvement in larger-scale finance. These weren't just merchants dealing in cloth or spices. These were people with access to substantial capital, able to make loans that princes and cities might need. All of this wealth, accumulated over decades or generations, was hidden in a wall as violence consumed the community. And there it sat for 649 years, waiting for the people who would never return. Construction workers discovered it in 1998 during renovations to a building on Michaelisstrasse in Erfurt. The Jews of Meissen represented something unusual in the medieval Jewish experience. Unlike most German Jewish communities, which were confined to urban areas and restricted to commercial activities, the Jews of Meissen included farmers who owned and worked agricultural land. This was extraordinary. The image of the medieval Jew as exclusively urban and commercial doesn't account for communities like Meissen, where Jews lived outside city walls and engaged in the same rural occupations as their Christian neighbors. The first synagogue recorded in all of Saxony was the one in Meissen, documented in 1320. The community also maintained a cemetery, a mikveh for ritual bathing, and all the institutional infrastructure of an established Jewish settlement. How did this anomaly develop? The historical record doesn't provide a complete answer. Perhaps the early settlement patterns in Meissen allowed Jews to acquire land before restrictions tightened. Perhaps local rulers found it advantageous to have Jewish farmers. Perhaps the community simply persisted in older patterns that were being squeezed out elsewhere. Whatever the explanation, Meissen represented a path not taken, a version of Jewish life in medieval Germany that might have developed more broadly if circumstances had been different. Jews as farmers, as landowners, as neighbors engaged in the same daily tasks as Christians around them. After 1349, it was all gone. The community would never be rebuilt. The experiment, whatever it represented, was over. By the early 14th century, the Jews of Saxon lands had been there for at least 300 years. That's longer than the United States has existed. That's enough time for 10 generations or more to have been born, lived, and died in these territories. The idea that Jews were foreigners, wanderers with no real roots, was always a theological construction rather than a historical reality. The Jews of Erfurt or Meissen or Leipzig were as local as anyone. Their ancestors had lived there for centuries. Their families were buried in local cemeteries. Their community institutions had history and memory and continuity. When the expulsions came, this all counted for nothing. 300 years of presence, of contribution, of simple existence in a place could be erased by one ruler's decree. The Jews were not citizens with rights. They were tolerated guests whose tolerance could be withdrawn. This precariousness was always there, lurking beneath the surface of daily life. However ordinary the days might seem, Jews knew that their position was fragile. The stories of past massacres were told from generation to generation. The knowledge of what happened in other cities traveled along the networks of commerce and scholarship. And yet they stayed. They built communities. They raised children. They maintained traditions. They invested in synagogues and cemeteries and Torah scrolls, all things that assumed a future. Maybe they hoped things would be different in their lifetime. Maybe they couldn't imagine anywhere else to go. Maybe the community itself, the familiar rhythms of Shabbat and the holiday, the web of family and friendship, was worth the risk. Whatever the reasons, they stayed until they were forced to leave. And when they left, they took with them the memories and practices and traditions that would sustain Jewish life in new places, under new circumstances, for centuries to come. The legal framework was in place. The economic tensions were building. The theological justification for hatred had been refined over centuries. All it would take was a catalyst, something to ignite the accumulated resentments into open violence. In 1348, that catalyst arrived. It came in the form of a disease, a terror that killed perhaps a third of Europe's population in just 4 years. And for the Jews of German lands, the Black Death would prove even more devastating than the plague itself. The plague arrived in Europe through the port of Messina in October 1347. Genoese trading ships limped into harbor, their crews already dying from a disease no one had seen before. Within weeks, the plague had spread to the Italian mainland. By 1348, it was racing north across the Alps into Germany. No one understood what was happening. Medieval medicine had no concept of bacteria or viruses. Physicians blamed corrupted air, bad alignments of the planets, punishment from God for human sins. The death rate was beyond anything in living memory. Entire villages were wiped out. Cities lost half their populations in months. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. The social fabric of Europe began to tear apart. And in this chaos, people searched desperately for an explanation. Someone had to be responsible. Someone had to be punished. The accusations began almost immediately. Jews were poisoning the wells. They were spreading the plague deliberately to destroy Christendom. They had obtained poison from rabbis in Toledo and distributed it through a vast conspiracy spanning all of Europe. The confessions were extracted through torture, the details absurdly specific. Packets of poison hidden in leather bags, dropped into wells and springs under cover of night. A coordinated campaign of mass murder. It was completely insane. Jews were dying from the plague at the same rates as Christians. They drank from the same wells, breathed the same air, lived in the same cities. The confessions were tortured fantasies, the accusations the product of panic and pre-existing hatred finding an outlet. But reason had no power against fear, and local authorities across Germany found the accusations extremely convenient. The massacres began in 1348 and continued through 1351. The Rindfleisch massacres of 1298 had destroyed 146 Jewish communities. The Black Death pogroms dwarfed even that horror. According to the careful scholarship of modern historians, at least 510 Jewish communities in German-speaking lands were destroyed between 1348 and 1351. Let that number sink in. 510 communities. Generations of accumulated life, worship, scholarship, and trade erased in 3 years. The Erfurt massacre of March 21st, 1349, stands as one of the most devastating single events in the history of Saxon Jewry. Erfurt was not a small community. It was one of the great Jewish centers of medieval Germany, home to what historians believe was a significant Talmudic academy. The old synagogue of Erfurt, portions of which still stand today, dated to around 1094. For 250 years, Jews had prayed in that building, studied in its schools, buried their dead in the community cemetery. On that March day in 1349, the Christian population of Erfurt turned on their Jewish neighbors. The sources are fragmentary, but the death toll was catastrophic. Some accounts suggest as many as 3,000 Jews were killed, though modern historians treat such numbers with caution, given the unreliability of medieval population estimates. What is certain is that the Jewish community of Erfurt was essentially destroyed. Survivors fled. The dead were left unburied. The properties were seized. And then something remarkable happened. Remarkable not because it was good, but because of what it reveals about human hope in the face of disaster. Sometime during the chaos, members of the Jewish community hid their most precious possessions. They gathered gold and silver objects, jewelry, coins, and a collection of items including a golden wedding ring inscribed in Hebrew with the words Mazel Tov. They placed these treasures in the wall of a building, perhaps hoping to return when the violence ended. No one ever came back for them. The Erfurt treasure remained hidden for 649 years. Construction workers discovered it in 1998 during renovations. The hoard included over 3,000 silver coins, 14 silver ingots, more than 700 pieces of Gothic gold and silver jewelry, and that wedding ring, a tiny circle of gold that someone thought worth hiding at the moment their world was ending. Today, the Erfurt treasure sits in a museum. It is a testament to the sophistication and wealth of the community that created it, and it is a memorial to the people who hid it, people who expected to return, but never did. The Meissen community suffered a different but equally complete destruction. Jews had lived in Meissen since at least the 12th century. The first synagogue recorded in all of Saxony was there. The community included those unusual Jewish farmers, people living outside city walls and working the land. After 1349, all of it was gone. The cemetery was converted into a cattle pasture, the graves of generations trampled by livestock. The synagogue was seized and repurposed. The Jews who survived fled east toward Poland and Bohemia, or to the handful of German cities that still tolerated Jewish settlement. Meissen would never again have a significant Jewish community. The destruction of 1349 was permanent. Not every community experienced direct massacre. Some rulers protected their Jews, motivated less by humanitarian concern than by financial calculation. Dead Jews paid no taxes. Expelled Jews took their skills and capital elsewhere. But even protection came with a price. Rulers who shielded Jews from mob violence often demanded crushing payments in return. The Jews were bled of their wealth, then blamed when they couldn't meet the next demand. The pattern that emerged across Germany in the decades after the Black Death was brutal in its logic. Violence would destroy a Jewish community. After a few years, the economic need for credit and commerce would lead rulers to invite Jews back. The returning Jews would rebuild, accumulate some modest prosperity, and then face another round of restrictions, extortions, and eventually expulsion. The cycle could repeat multiple times in a single city over a century. Leipzig provides a clear example. Jews had settled there by 1250 at the latest, or drawn by the famous trade fairs that made Leipzig one of the commercial centers of central Germany. In 1268, Margrave Dietrich of Landsberg granted them formal privileges, specifically protecting their right to participate in the fairs. But in 1349, during the Black Death, the Leipzig Jews were expelled or killed. The community disappeared. Then Jews returned. By the late 1300s, there was again a Jewish presence in Leipzig. The city needed their capital and commercial connections too badly to do without them permanently. Then came another expulsion, part of the broader Saxon expulsion of the 1430s. The resilience was remarkable, but so was the pattern of repeated destruction. Between the Black Death massacres and the Saxon expulsion of the 1430s, roughly 80 years passed. This was enough time for partial recovery, for some communities to rebuild, for a new generation to be born that had no direct memory of 1349. But the recovery was incomplete, and the conditions that had made the massacres possible remained firmly in place. The Emperor Charles IV, who reigned during the Black Death years, had tried to protect Jews in some places while allowing their destruction in others. His policy was inconsistent, driven more by financial calculation than by principle. Where Jews could pay enough, they might be protected. Where they couldn't, or where local pressures were too strong, they were abandoned. After the plague, Charles issued new privileges inviting Jews to return to cities that had expelled or massacred them. But these privileges came with heavy financial conditions. Jews who returned had to pay for the right to do so. They had to accept new restrictions on their activities. They had to rebuild from nothing in places that had destroyed everything they had. The psychological impact of this return was complex. Imagine coming back to a city where your parents or grandparents had been killed. Imagine trying to rebuild a community in a place where your neighbors had turned on your people with murder in their hearts just a generation before. Imagine raising children there, knowing what had happened, wondering if it could happen again. Some Jews did return. The economic pressures that had originally created space for Jewish communities remained in force. Cities needed credit. Rulers needed revenue. The functions Jews had served were still needed, even if the people who had served them had been killed or driven out. But the returning communities were smaller, poorer, more vulnerable than what had come before. The great centers of Jewish learning that had existed in the Rhineland and adjacent areas were devastated. The networks of scholarship and family that had connected Jewish communities across Europe were torn apart. Something had been broken that would never be fully repaired. In Saxony specifically, the records suggest modest Jewish presence in some towns by the late 14th century. Leipzig, as we've noted, saw Jews return despite the violence of 1349. But these communities were shadows of what had existed before. The great synagogue of Erfurt, dating to 1094, stood empty or repurposed. The scholars who had studied there were dead or scattered. The institutions that had made Erfurt a center of Jewish learning were gone. The church continued to preach that Jews were enemies of Christ, cursed for their rejection of the Messiah. The mendicant orders, the Franciscans and Dominicans who preached directly to common people, were often the most aggressive in spreading anti-Jewish sentiment. These were not marginal extremists, but respected clergy whose sermons shaped popular opinion. The economic resentments continued to fester. Christian debtors still owed money to Jewish lenders. Guild restrictions still blocked Jews from most trades, forcing continued concentration in finance. The interest rates remained high because the risks remained high, and the high rates continued to generate fury among borrowers. And the political fragmentation of the Holy Roman Empire meant that Jewish security depended entirely on the calculations of individual territorial rulers. There was no central authority to guarantee Jewish rights across the empire. Each prince, each elector, yet each city council made its own decisions about whether to tolerate, exploit, or expel the Jews within its borders. In this environment, the Jews of Saxony, who survived 1349, and their descendants lived in a state of permanent precariousness. They rebuilt what they could. They paid the taxes demanded of them. They tried to cultivate good relations with whoever held power. But they knew, as Jews across Germany knew, that their position could collapse at any moment. All it would take was another crisis. The 15th century opened with political chaos across the Holy Roman Empire. The Great Schism had divided the Church, with competing popes, both claiming supreme authority. The Council of Constance, convened in 1414 to resolve the schism, also took up the case of Jan Hus, the Bohemian reformer whose teachings had attracted a massive following. Hus had criticized church corruption, questioned the authority of the papacy, and advocated for Scripture to be available in the vernacular. His ideas drew on earlier reformers, but his message resonated with particular force in Bohemia, where it became entangled with Czech nationalist resentment of German ecclesiastical dominance. The Council of Constance promised Hus safe conduct to present his case. Then, on July 6, 1415, they burned him alive as a heretic. The execution of Jan Hus ignited Bohemia. His followers, who would become known as Hussites, arose in armed rebellion against the Church and the Holy Roman Empire. What began as a religious dispute became a full-scale military conflict that would devastate Central Europe for nearly 2 decades, and Saxony was directly in the path of Hussite expansion. The Hussite Wars of 1419 to 1434 were unlike anything the region had experienced. The Hussite armies, motivated by religious fervor and skilled in innovative military tactics, defeated imperial force after imperial force. They pioneered the use of war wagons, heavy carts fitted with wooden walls and gun ports that could be chained together into mobile fortifications. When imperial cavalry charged, they found themselves facing what amounted to an instant fortress, manned by disciplined infantry armed with crossbows and early firearms. The Hussites also developed sophisticated combined arms tactics, coordinating infantry, cavalry, and artillery in ways that the feudal armies of the empire struggled to counter. Their religious motivation gave them cohesion and determination that professional soldiers fighting for pay could not match. They believed they were fighting for God, and they fought like it. 5 crusades were launched against them. All 5 failed. The First Crusade of 1420 collapsed at the Battle of Witkov Hill, where Hussite forces under Jan Žižka routed the imperial army outside Prague. The Second Crusade of 1421 fared no better, its armies melting away before they could bring the Hussites to decisive battle. The Third Crusade of 1422 achieved almost nothing. The Fourth Crusade of 1427 ended in another crushing defeat. For Saxony, the war was catastrophic. Hussite raiders struck deep into Saxon territory, burning towns, destroying churches, killing or capturing thousands. The Battle of Aussig in 1426 saw a massive Saxon army annihilated, with thousands of Saxon knights and soldiers killed or captured. The flower of Saxon military power was cut down in a single afternoon, leaving the territory nearly defenseless. And then came the great Hussite invasion of 1429 to 1430. In the winter of 1429, Hussite forces crossed into Saxony in overwhelming numbers. They weren't just raiding anymore. They were conducting a sustained campaign of destruction across the heart of Saxon territory. The scale of the devastation defies easy summary. Contemporary sources describe 18 cities destroyed or badly damaged, hundreds of villages burned, countless churches and monasteries razed. The town of Plauen was sacked. Altenburg was attacked. The destruction reached almost to the walls of Leipzig itself. For weeks, the Hussites moved through Saxony almost at will, burning and killing. The population fled before them or hid in fortified places, hoping the storm would pass. The fields were left untended. The livestock was seized or slaughtered. The economic infrastructure of entire regions was devastated. The Elector of Saxony, Frederick II, was supposed to defend his people. That was the fundamental bargain of medieval lordship. The ruler provided protection, and in return the people owed him obedience and service. Frederick could not fulfill his end of the bargain. The Saxon forces were inadequate to stop the Hussites. The imperial crusades kept failing, and the people of Saxony, watching their homes burn and their neighbors die, desperately wanted someone to blame. To understand why the Hussite accusation worked, why anyone believed that Jews had collaborated with Christian heretics fighting over Christian theological disputes, you have to understand what the Hussite Wars did to Saxon society. These weren't just battles. This was trauma on a civilizational scale. The Hussites burned churches with particular fury. To them, the Catholic Church was the enemy, its buildings symbols of the corruption they were fighting against. The smoke from burning churches rose over Saxon villages as the invaders passed through. Towns that resisted were sacked. Crops were destroyed. Livestock was seized or slaughtered. The peasants who survived the initial attacks faced the prospect of starvation in the winter that followed. And where were the Saxon authorities during all this? Where was Frederick II, the young elector responsible for defending his territories? The honest answer is that he was overwhelmed. The military resources of Saxony were inadequate to stop the Hussite armies. The imperial crusades kept failing. The promises of support from other territories often proved empty. Frederick was a young man doing his best in an impossible situation. But his best wasn't good enough. His people were dying, his territory was burning, and he couldn't stop it. This is the context in which the accusation against the Jews emerged. A traumatized society searching desperately for explanations. A ruler whose authority was undermined by military failure. A population that had been taught for generations that Jews were enemies of Christ. Consider the logic from the perspective of a Saxon peasant whose village had just been burned by Hussites. You're grieving. You're terrified. You've lost family members, neighbors, everything you owned. The armies that were supposed to protect you have been defeated. The church that promised God's favor seems impotent against these heretics. You need an explanation. Why did this happen? Why did God allow it? Then someone tells you that it wasn't just the Hussites. The Jews helped them. The Jews, those people who live in the city, who lend money at interest, who killed Christ according to what you've been taught since childhood. They told the Hussites where to attack. They passed information. They provided supplies. They're the reason your village burned. Does this explanation make logical sense? No. The Hussites didn't need Jewish help to find Saxon villages. They had their own scouts, their own intelligence networks. And the idea of Jews collaborating with Christian heretics fighting over communion practices and biblical translation is absurd on its face. But trauma doesn't respond to logic. Trauma responds to narrative. And the narrative of Jewish treachery fit perfectly into centuries of accumulated suspicion and hatred. The Jews were already outsiders, already suspect, already blamed for every misfortune from the Black Death to local crop failures. Adding Hussite collaboration to the list of charges required no new conceptual apparatus. It was just another instance of what everyone already knew, or thought they knew. Frederick II became Elector of Saxony in 1428, inheriting power at the age of 16. His father, Frederick I, had died after just 5 years as Elector, leaving the young prince to govern during the worst crisis the territory had ever faced. History would give him the epithet the Gentle. This nickname is one of the small ironies that pepper medieval history. Frederick would prove gentle in his personal manner, perhaps, gentle in his dealings with the nobility, gentle in his pursuit of peace settlements. But toward the Jews of his realm, he would prove anything but gentle. The expulsion unfolded over approximately 3 years, from 1430 to 1433. It was not a single dramatic event, but a phased process of escalating restrictions, localized violence, formal legal decrees, and finally total exclusion. The violence in Dresden began on February 25, 1430. Dresden was not one of the largest Jewish communities in Saxony, but it was established and visible, located in the emerging center of Saxon political power. And on that February day, the fragile peace that had allowed Jews and Christians to coexist in the city collapsed. When what we know about the Dresden attack comes primarily from Alphonse Levy's Geschichte der Juden in Sachsen, compiled in 1900 from archival sources. Levy documented the names of some of the victims: Salmon, Katzmann, Perla, Jakob, Smol, Sennelskind. These were real people with real names, people who had lived in Dresden, conducted business there, raised families there. Now they were dead or driven out, their property seized. Some later sources attributed particular influence to Margaret of Austria, Frederick's wife, in driving the expulsion. The 19th century historian F. Perthus, writing in 1830, claimed that Margaret encouraged the expulsion out of religious zeal. This attribution deserves skeptical examination. Margaret was born around 1416, making her approximately 14 years old when the Dresden violence occurred in February 1430, and around 15 when she married Frederick in June 1431. She was a teenager, newly arrived in a foreign court, surrounded by advisors and power structures that long predated her arrival. Could a teenage bride have influenced such a major policy decision? It's not impossible. Medieval princesses sometimes wielded significant influence despite their youth. But the timing is awkward. The expulsion began before the marriage took place. The Dresden violence preceded Margaret's arrival by over a year. Modern scholarship has been cautious about Margaret's role. The Sächsische biography entry for Frederick, written by Elfie Marita Eibel in 2005, makes no mention of Margaret's involvement. The Jewish Encyclopedia is silent on any particular role for Frederick's wife. When you see a teenage bride blamed for a policy that began before her marriage, skepticism is warranted. What seems more likely is that Frederick acted on advice from his existing court, from church officials pressing for Jewish removal, from nobles who owed money to Jewish lenders, and from his own calculation of political and financial advantage. Over the following months and years, the expulsion expanded across Saxon territory. The historical records do not preserve a single dramatic decree. That may reflect gaps in the surviving documentation, or it may reflect how the expulsion actually worked through an accumulation of local orders and understood policies rather than a single proclamation. What we can document is that by 1432 or 1433, the expulsion was complete. The Jews had been removed from all territories under Frederick's control. The Margraviate of Meissen, Thuringia, and the broader Saxon lands were officially cleared of Jews. The justification remained the same throughout, the charge of Hussite sympathy. Frederick claimed that the Jews had collaborated with the enemies who had burned Saxon cities. The expulsion was presented as a defensive measure, an act of security rather than persecution. This framing was important. Medieval rulers preferred to justify their actions in terms their subjects and peers would accept. Naked confiscation of Jewish property would have looked like simple theft. But confiscation of property belonging to traitors? That was justice. The confiscation of Jewish property was central to the expulsion's economic logic. When Jews were expelled, they could not take everything with them. Real property was immovable by definition. Synagogues, cemeteries, houses, and businesses remained behind. Debts owed to Jews could be canceled outright or redirected to the ruler. Movable property could be seized at the border or heavily taxed on departure, extracting one final payment from people who had already been paying special Jewish taxes their entire lives. For a treasury drained by years of war, this represented a significant windfall. Frederick did not need to raise taxes from his own nobility or towns, a process that would have required difficult negotiations with the estates and generated political opposition. He did not need to explain why they should fund his government when his government had failed to protect them from the Hussites. He simply took what the Jews had. The mechanics of confiscation varied. In some cases, princely officials directly seized Jewish property and added it to the treasury's holdings. In other cases, properties were sold to Christians, with the proceeds going to the prince. In still other cases, favored nobles or officials received grants of former Jewish properties as rewards for loyalty or service. Debts were handled with similar flexibility. A Christian who owed money to an expelled Jewish lender might simply be released from the obligation, his debt canceled by princely decree. Alternatively, the prince might claim the debt for himself, ordering the Christian debtor to pay the treasury instead of the now absent Jewish creditor. Either way, the Jews who had extended the credit lost everything. The expulsion also eliminated Jewish debts owed by Christians within Saxony in ways that benefited the entire Christian population that had borrowed from Jews. Any noble, Merchant or peasant who had borrowed from Jewish lenders saw those obligations disappear. The Jews who held the notes were gone, while the princely authority that might have enforced collection had no interest in doing so on behalf of expelled non-Christians. This was a massive wealth transfer from Jews to Christians, particularly to Christian debtors and to the princely treasury. It was exactly the kind of transfer that had occurred during and after the Black Death massacres, when rulers and mobs had combined violence against Jews with seizure of their property. The hatred was real. The financial benefits were also real. And the two reinforced each other in ways that made expulsion attractive to rulers throughout the German lands. Where did the expelled Jews go? The historical record is frustratingly incomplete on this question. We have no systematic documentation of Jewish refugees from Saxony, no lists of names with destinations, no census of the displaced. The expelled Jews vanished from Saxon records the moment they crossed the border, becoming invisible to the documentation that might have tracked them. But we can make educated inferences based on broader patterns of Jewish migration in this period. Some likely went to Poland, which was in the process of becoming the great center of Ashkenazi Jewish life. The Polish kings had been actively encouraging Jewish settlement since the 13th century, issuing generous charters of protection. The Statute of Calais, first issued in 1264 and repeatedly reaffirmed by subsequent Polish rulers, provided Jews with extensive protections unmatched anywhere in Western or Central Europe. Under the Calais Statute, Jews in Poland could engage in trade and money lending, own property, practice their religion freely, and govern their own communities according to Jewish law. Polish kings saw Jews as economically valuable subjects who could help develop the kingdom's commerce and provide credit for the crown. This was a pragmatic calculation, not a humanitarian one. But the effect was to make Poland a haven for Jews fleeing persecution elsewhere. As German territories expelled Jews one after another through the 14th and 15th centuries, Poland absorbed them. The Jewish population of Poland grew from perhaps 15,000 in 1400 to some 150,000 by 1500. Many of those new arrivals came from German lands like Saxony, bringing with them the Yiddish language, the customs, and the religious traditions of the Ashkenazi world. Others probably went to Bohemia, at least temporarily. Despite the chaos of the Hussite Wars, Jewish communities continued to exist in some Bohemian cities, and Prague maintained one of the largest Jewish populations in Central Europe. The famous Altneu Synagogue in Prague, still standing today, dated to the 13th century and represented the kind of institutional continuity that survived even the worst persecutions. Still others may have found refuge in the shrinking number of German cities that continued to tolerate Jewish residents. Frankfurt, Worms, and a few other places maintained small Jewish communities throughout this period, though under increasingly precarious conditions. These communities served as way stations for some refugees and permanent homes for others, depending on individual circumstances and the constantly shifting policies of local authorities. And some undoubtedly converted. Faced with expulsion and the loss of everything, some Jews accepted baptism and attempted to integrate into Christian society. We don't know how many took this path, or how successful their integration proved to be. Conversion was always an option that medieval Christians offered to Jews, presented as the ultimate solution from the Christian perspective. Some Jews accepted it under duress, then tried to maintain Jewish practice in secret, while creating communities of crypto-Jews whose descendants would struggle with questions of identity for generations. Others converted sincerely and assimilated completely within a few generations, their Jewish ancestry becoming a forgotten footnote in family histories. Still others found that conversion brought only partial acceptance, that the stain of Jewish ancestry followed them and their children regardless of their baptism. For the individuals involved, whatever path they chose, expulsion meant the complete destruction of their lives as they had known them. Homes abandoned, businesses lost, communities scattered, the synagogues where they had prayed, the cemeteries where their ancestors lay buried, taken and desecrated. Everything they had built over generations erased in a matter of months. The confiscated properties were quickly absorbed into Christian hands. Synagogues were repurposed or demolished, the valuable objects within them. The Torah scrolls and silver ornaments and ritual objects were seized or destroyed. Buildings that had served sacred purposes for centuries became warehouses, stables, or private homes. Houses and businesses were claimed by the treasury or distributed to favored Christians. Debts that had been owed to Jews were either canceled entirely or redirected so that payments now flowed to Christian creditors or to the prince himself. The cemeteries posed a particular question. Jewish cemeteries were supposed to be permanent, sacred ground where the dead would rest undisturbed until the resurrection. But to Christians who had expelled the Jews, they were simply land. In Meissen, we know what happened to the cemetery. It became a cattle pasture. The graves of generations were trampled by livestock. The gravestones were removed or knocked over. The inscriptions, recording names and dates and words of mourning, were left to wear away. This was not accidental neglect. It was deliberate desecration, a statement that the Jews who had lived there were not merely absent, but erased from memory. Frederick II continued to rule Saxony for another 3 decades after the expulsion. He died in 1464, having governed for 36 years. His epithet survived him, Frederick the Gentle, a man who could be remembered as gentle, as mild in his dealings with the nobility and in his pursuit of diplomatic solutions. Despite having expelled an entire population from lands their ancestors had inhabited for centuries, the expulsion appears not to have damaged his reputation among his contemporaries. If anything, it may have enhanced it. He had demonstrated decisive action during a crisis. He had confiscated the wealth of alleged traitors. He had purified his territories of a suspect population. The human cost, the families scattered, the communities destroyed, the centuries of accumulated life erased, doesn't seem to have weighed heavily on the historical memory of his reign. The immediate economic impact on Saxony was modest. This is an uncomfortable truth, but it is what the historical record shows. The territory did not collapse economically after expelling its Jews. Trade continued. The Leipzig fairs maintained their importance as one of the great commercial gatherings of Central Europe. Part of this was simply that the Jewish population was small relative to the whole. Medieval Jewish communities rarely exceeded 1,000 people in a single city, typically numbering under 300. In a territory with hundreds of thousands of Christian inhabitants, engaged in agriculture and crafts and trade of every kind, the removal of a few hundred or a few thousand Jews was economically manageable. The economy was not dependent on them in any existential sense. Part of it was that alternative sources of credit existed. The Christian bankers, from the Lombard firms and South German banking houses that had been expanding north of the Alps since the late medieval period, could fill the gap left by Jewish moneylenders. The economic function Jews had served could be performed by others who were willing to find ways around the Church's prohibition on usury, or who simply ignored the prohibition knowing that enforcement was lax. These Christian bankers charged interest just as Jews had, often using legal fictions to disguise what they were doing. They called their charges fees or gifts rather than interest. They embedded the cost of credit in inflated principal amounts. They found ways to profit from lending while maintaining the appearance of compliance with canon law. The economics of credit remained the same. Only the religious identity of the creditors changed. A part of the modest economic impact was also that the expulsion generated a one-time windfall that masked any longer-term costs. The confiscated property enriched the treasury immediately. The canceled debts relieved Christian borrowers of obligations they had been struggling to meet. In the short term, the expulsion may actually have been economically beneficial to those who remained, however unjust the gains and however ill-gotten the benefits. The nobles who had borrowed from Jewish lenders found themselves suddenly free of debt. The merchants who had competed with Jewish traders found their competition removed. The treasury that had been drained by years of unsuccessful war against the Hussites found itself suddenly enriched by confiscated Jewish property. Everyone who had resented the Jews, for whatever reason, found themselves better off in immediate material terms. This doesn't make the expulsion right. It doesn't justify what was done, but it explains why rulers found expulsion attractive, why the pattern repeated across German lands throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, why territory after territory followed the same path. The hatred was real. The financial benefits were also real. And when hatred aligned with profit, the combination proved irresistible. In the towns where Jews had lived, physical traces remained for a time. Buildings that had housed Jewish families still stood, their architecture unchanged even as new Christian owners moved in. The structures that had served as synagogues, though repurposed to Christian uses or converted to warehouses and the workshops, retained their architectural forms. A careful observer might notice the niche where the Torah Ark had stood, or the orientation of the building toward Jerusalem, or other features that spoke of the building's original purpose. The locations of cemeteries were remembered, at least for a generation or two. Even if the graves themselves were desecrated, people knew that Jews had been buried there, that the pasture where cattle now grazed had once been sacred ground. But as decades passed and memories faded, even this knowledge was lost. But memory fades. This is the nature of human remembrance. Within a generation, children were growing up who had never known Jews as neighbors, who had never seen the inside of a synagogue, who had never watched a Jewish family observing the Sabbath. For them, Jews were abstractions, characters in sermons about Christ killers, not real people who had lived next door. Within 2 generations, the Jewish presence was becoming historical rather than living memory. The old people who could remember individual Jews, who had done business with them or simply seen them in the streets, were dying off. Their grandchildren inherited stories, perhaps. But stories are not the same as experience. The Jews became figures from the past, as remote as characters in folk tales. The absence was normalized. Jews weren't there. They hadn't been there for as long as anyone could remember. The diversity that once existed became hard to imagine. New generations grew up thinking that the way things were was the way things had always been, that Saxony had always been a land without Jews, that the absence was natural rather than imposed. This normalization of absence is one of the most insidious effects of expulsion. The expelled group vanishes from daily experience. Their contributions are forgotten. Their absence is no longer noticed because there is nothing to compare it to. New generations grow up never questioning why certain people aren't there, never imagining that things could be different. The children of the expelled grew up hearing stories. They heard about the synagogue in Erfurt, one of the oldest in German lands, where scholars had studied for generations. They heard about the Torah scrolls that had been copied by hand over months of painstaking work, the silver ornaments that had adorned them, the prayers that had been offered within those walls for 250 years. They heard about the cemetery in Meissen, now a cattle pasture. They heard about ancestors whose graves had been desecrated, whose bones were no longer at rest, whose memorial stones had been torn up or knocked over. They heard about the farmers who had worked the land outside the city walls, Jews who had lived differently from other Jews, who had demonstrated that Jewish life could take many forms, and whose community had been erased so completely that nothing remained. They heard about Dresden, about Salman and Katzmann, and Perla, and Jakov, and Smul, and Senelskint, names preserved in fragments of historical record, people who had done nothing wrong, who had committed no crime, who had simply been Jewish in the wrong place at the wrong time, people whose only offense was being useful enough to resent and vulnerable enough to attack. These stories became part of collective memory. They were incorporated into the broader narrative of Jewish suffering and exile, the long history of expulsions and massacres that stretched back to the destruction of the Temple in Jerusalem. Each generation added its own catastrophes to the story, its own martyrs to the roll of the dead, its own lessons about the precariousness of Jewish existence in Christian lands. and the stories shaped expectations. Jews who grew up on these stories learned that their position was always precarious, that acceptance could turn to hatred in a moment, that centuries of presence meant nothing when rulers decided expulsion was convenient. They learned to keep their wealth in portable forms, in gold and gems and skills that could travel with them. They learned to maintain connections across political boundaries, to have somewhere to flee when flight became necessary. This knowledge, hard-won through generations of tragedy, became part of what it meant to be a Jew in medieval and early modern Europe. Trust was dangerous. Roots could be torn up at any moment. What you could carry with you, learning and faith and family, mattered more than what you could build in any particular place. Families scattered to Poland, Bohemia, and the handful of German cities that still permitted Jewish residence. Property was confiscated by the treasury and redistributed to Christians who had done nothing to earn it except be present when the Jews were driven out. Communities that had existed for 300 years and more were erased in the span of a few years, their institutions dismantled, their records scattered or destroyed, their very memory beginning to fade from the places they had called home. The expelled Jews rebuilt where they could. In Poland, they found rulers who valued their economic contributions and granted them protections that German princes had withdrawn. In Prague, they joined one of the great surviving Jewish communities of Central Europe. In the scattered German cities that still tolerated them, they lived under the constant shadow of the next expulsion, never knowing when their time would come. They maintained their traditions. They studied Torah and Talmud. They observed the Sabbath and the holidays. They circumcised their sons and married their daughters according to Jewish law. They kept alive the learning and the practices that had sustained their ancestors through centuries of persecution, and that would sustain their descendants through centuries more. They raised children and told them stories of what had been lost: the synagogue in Erfurt, the cemetery in Meissen, the scholars and the merchants and the ordinary people who had lived their lives in Saxon lands and then been driven out. These stories became part of the inheritance that each generation passed to the next, alongside the Torah and the prayers and the customs of daily life, and Saxony continued without them. The territory prospered in the decades after the expulsion. The silver mines of the Erzgebirge would soon yield wealth beyond anything the medieval economy had known. The Leipzig fairs continued to draw merchants from across Europe. The Wettin dynasty that Frederick represented would remain in power for centuries. The rulers maintained their power. The church continued preaching. The guilds continued their trades. Life went on for the Christians who remained, largely unchanged by the absence of neighbors they had never much wanted anyway. The absence of Jews became normal, unremarkable, simply the way things were. Children grew up never knowing Jews as neighbors. Grandchildren grew up never having heard their grandparents speak of Jewish neighbors. Within a few generations, the Jewish presence in Saxony was historical memory at best, and for most people not even that. The synagogues fell silent, their buildings repurposed to serve Christian needs or simply left to decay. The cemeteries became pastures and building sites, the graves of generations forgotten beneath new construction. The names of the expelled were forgotten, lost to historical records that no one bothered to preserve. If you found this history interesting, this next video will shock you. Click right here to watch it now.